Hi, I'm GUY McKENNA and I'm hanging out with Zero Hanger. Kenny would just look at me and go, mate, he's just a freak. We had the biggest list, but we had the smallest coaching staff. We had the smallest welfare. I mean, go figure. With him last year and the things he was doing as a first-year player, I saw him more ballistic and probably just slightly a bit cleaner than Chris Judd. They'll compete to a certain time, but ultimately it's like the whoopee cushion effect. You know, the energy runs out.
Today we're hanging out with GUY McKenna, two-time West Coast Premiership player and the inaugural coach of the Gold Coast Suns. And what better time to talk about the Suns than ahead of their first AFL final. We also have some good stories with Carmichael Hunt, Gary Ablett Jr, David Swallow. We talk about Tassie and their list build and what GUY McKenna thinks they should do, as well as his days at West Coast and how they're currently going. All that and plenty more on this episode. A two-time Premiership player with West Coast, a former club captain, a best and fairest winner, an All-Australian, and the inaugural coach of the Gold Coast Suns. We're joined by GUY McKenna this week. We're hanging out for a session that's going to be a pretty big week for the Suns. Their first final coming up this weekend against Fremantle. It's been a long process for the club, and what better way to dissect the journey that they've been on than being with their first coach. Guy, how are you?
Good, yeah, feeling, very excited for the footy club, of course, because, yes, many moons ago, we were back up there in the old Carrara, and I was sort of just reminiscing a bit. I'm actually heading up there this Thursday to do a function, and just talking to the old conditioning coach about going out and buying the lunches on the Tuesday night at Coles or Woolies up there, and then serving it to them after training, getting them used to good diets and all those sorts of things post-training. So, we're giggling and laughing about the 2 trolley runs we used to do to the cars with all the food and gear in it.
It's certainly been a long journey for the club. Obviously, you were appointed back in 2008, obviously the first season coming a few years after then. A few coaches in between with Rodney Eade and Stuart Ewe, and now Damien Harwick, and they've got certainly some different names coming through from a personnel talent on field. Obviously, your tenure kicked off with Gary Ablett Jr. We'll get a bit on him in a little bit, but the journey that the Gold Coast Suns have taken and what you've probably seen since leaving the club has still obviously been so hard for just about anyone that's just tried to steer this club towards September. Obviously, what Damien Harwick's doing right now with his feet under the desk over the last 18 months has been such a great improvement and a fresh voice for them. What have you kind of seen of the Suns under Dimmer's tenure over the last 18 months?
Oh, well, yeah, look, I think, the history of Gold Coast, everyone's always asked me, so what's the matter with the Gold Coast? As you mentioned, those other coaches that took the job on after me, it's just, well, they just physically haven't got old. They're still young. They've always been young. And again, I always just liken it in the business world or the working world of, people that come through your door for the first year accountants versus second year accountants versus third year accountants, all that sort of stuff. Apprentices are no different. You want to have a game of golf with your mate on the weekend. Who are you going to throw your keys to? Your first year apprentice or your third year apprentice? And probably in the early days, myself and Rocket, maybe Stewie, just when he took over from Rocket, maybe only had, and again, the other scenario I like to talk to is high school. So I took over, obviously got these kids as year 8s, got them to year 9s. Rocket took them over as year 9s and then probably stripped the list back, went to year 8s again, then got them back up to year 9s. Dewey got him into year 10, and then sort of just on 11 just before he got sacked. And that's where, so now they're getting older because, again, the year 12s, like the Collingwoods, Geelongs, the older sides of obviously this year, you can compete to a certain time, but ultimately the experience just lasts longer, because you've been in the gym longer. And I sort of say to people, you got to understand that when you get a draftee and a young player in, he comes into the gym and he might bench 60 or 70 kilos. You give him 4 or 5 years in the system, he's now benching over 100 and he's squatting probably double of what he started with. And so it makes a difference on field because, again, the contests he can get to and actually hold his feet, the lines he can run through because he's quicker and stronger. So it makes a huge difference. So when you're dealing with a young side, and they might be super talented as GWS and Gold Coast have been, they'll compete to a certain time, but ultimately it's like the whoopee cushion effect. The energy runs out and they can't go. And so hence, even with Dimmer, there's been late season fade outs, late quarter fade out, all that sort of stuff. And because there's still so many kids still in the side, but they're certainly a lot older than they ever have been, certainly in the previous coaches' tenures. So, look, that's the thing now. Obviously, his experience of obviously coaching Richmond, so that's certainly going to help Gold Coast into the final series. And look, they have a couple of finals, fellas, but ultimately, a lot of those youngish kids, when I say young, but again, all those other coaches, I'm just looking at Matty Rowell and Noah Anderson, for example. Well, they both played over 100 games. Stewie Jew, Rocket Eden, myself are looking around to say, well, where's our 100-game players of young talent? We just didn't have them. So, he's got them at a good time. Look, it's going to be a huge exposure to them in the finals because we know finals is another step up. So that's going to be a huge challenge for them. But certainly with Damien as coach, having coached Richmond through finals, they're certainly in good hands.
When we were talking about how young the list was, I think there's a lot of talk this year about what Essendon's gone through, 15 or so debutants. And I think in your first year, you had more than double that, just given the draft.
Sorry, may I butt in? We had 15 in our first game, not across the season. We had 15. Well, I was just talking again to my mate up on the Gold Coast. If you remember the year, I said we had, how's this, in our third year? So all our 18-year-olds, if you don't mind, 15 of those boys, of course, debutants, but 18. We had 18 21sts. To get through 1 year. We go, this is the third year of our existence. We're going to have 18 21st. I mean, then we had a 23-round season. We're going, how's that going to work? We're going to have a 21st every Saturday night. I said, I don't think that's going to happen. So we actually quickly came together and we organised it was mid-January, I still remember it. And one of the great sponsors up on the Gold Coast, he used to run the Hellenica, the Greek restaurant. So he wanted to do something for us. So I rang him up. I said, mate, would you reckon you'd put on? So he actually put on. It was fantastic. So all the players, they wanted them at the 21st themselves, which was fine. So we had a meal, beautiful Greek meal, with all the players, partners that were up. And we had this 21st in mid-January, which, look, probably worked out okay because we said, hey, boys, if you're going to have a blowout, let's have a blowout in January. You can't have 18 blowouts during the course of the season because we'd just come off a 3-game winning season. And that year actually worked out well because, it may have been better, but we had 8 wins that year. So at least the boys were concentrating on the field rather than off the field.
So, we go back to that first year. You have 15 that first game, as you mentioned. It got balloons out past 30 all up by the end of the season. On top of, obviously, the young players that you've got coming through the first year in AFL footy, they're on the Gold Coast. What were the other challenges you had with some of the personnel and trying to gel this group together and try and, I guess, form a football club, literally?
Yeah, we had a big list, and sort of was funny because we had the 18s, so we had a very small group of the 18s that came in, so they'd already done one pre-season, obviously an 18s pre-season, and then the next year we were joined by David Swallow, who knew we were going to pick him first round, so he came and joined some of the other 17-year-olds because we took those 17-year-olds out of the draft so we could have them a year in the VFL, which is really important. We had, now all of a sudden these kids, boys, were playing up against men in the VFL. Not as obviously talented as the AFL, but they were still men and big fellas. So getting used to that contest with bigger bodies, so that was so important. And then the AFL boys, and then that's probably a fourth one. But then we had the draft, so then we had our third iteration of players, and then because of the older boys, Josh Fraser, Gary Ablett, Carmichael Hunt, I'm sure we'll talk about. Nathan Bock, Michael Riscatelli, these boys were the older ones, and so they came in the fourth wave, if you like, in through a pre-season. So we had to join all that together and then have a pre-season where I think we had 35 players of our 53 on our list that were under 23 years of age. I think we had Danny Stanley, who I knew at Collingwood, and Sammy Isles, who were two great servants at Collingwood, which were going to be really good for tying up that sort of middle age bracket, and they were fantastic. They came up. So, we had 35 players under the age of 23. So it was, interesting. We had one welfare officer, go figure. I mean, we had the youngest list going around, but we had one officer trying to deal with 35 players. So it was crazy. So, Simon Fletcher was his name, and Dean Solomon, who was an assistant coach, but freshly out of footy. They did a lot of hard yards off the field with the fellas. And look, the Gold Coast gets probably it gets sort of the bad rap as far as a party town. As it turns out that I think, Victoria and Sydney are a lot worse per head of capita and things like that. So the AFL, in their wisdom, of course, they send it around, and they still do it, which is fantastic. Educate the players, excuse the expression, the sex, drugs and rock and roll talk, as we say. But obviously in the coast with so many young kids, we actually went and got a senior detective out of the Gold Coast who would actually do one or two more presentations through the course of the year, just to explain to the fellas, look, this place is probably a safe place to go. This place, don't go there because this and this happens, all that sort of stuff. So we had to, we knew we had to go over and above on that side of the welfare side of things off the field because, the traps and the wrong paths you could potentially take. But again, no different to any other state, as we've seen, and I've certainly heard and written about. But yeah, we just had to be conscious because they were so young.
Yeah, so holistically, taking a look back at the club and Gold Coast itself, it's obviously not necessarily a football state, definitely, and only Brisbane occupying their space there at the time. How do you, I guess, sell the players in terms of, coming to Gold Coast? Now, as you said, it was a bit of a party city, or it's dubbed a party city in town. But aside from maybe the allure of playing AFL football, what was the pitch to some of the players like your Gary Ablett, your Michael Riscatellis, your Danny Stanleys, as you said, Sam Isles, and even Carmichael Hunt, obviously played NRL before he switched to AFL?
Well, it was a fairly easy pitch once Gary decided to come. That was for sure, because you don't often get to play with a player of Gary's ilk. So once we could announce him, it made it a very easy pitch to sell to other players. Of course, the draftees had no choice. But again, what we're trying to do is build this club from a group of young, talented players and get them through. And I think everyone talks to the GWS difference between us and GWS. There was a second year where we went for kids again. GWS went for another, they went for their first group of senior players. I think Shane Mumford was one. I think from memory he's still running around, isn't he, at 43 years of age just about. But they went and got him. Heath Shaw, handy player, I would have thought, from Collingwood. Over 300 games. Ryan Griffin, who was, again, a Western Bulldogs captain, so experienced again. And a couple of other players, I think I want to say this in a nice way, Pinch from Sydney, who are experienced players. They didn't play a lot of senior football for them, but they're in running around the reserves, helping the young kids through. And that was the difference I saw in GWS and us, and that's why they were able to bridge that gap a lot sooner than what Gold Coast has, because we just kept getting young. And again, as I said at the start of the show, people used to ask me, I said, well, what's the problem? Is we just keep getting young. So we replace a 20-year-old with a 19 or 18-year-old that's only played 3 or 4 games. GWS could replace a young superstar, 19, needs to be rested or has got sore. All of a sudden they could pluck, or Heath Shaw was playing, but they could pluck another experienced player, like a 22 or a 23-year-old to fill him. So he actually had some trams and trains about how to play the game. He was a bit more composed. He wasn't super sexy like the young kids, but he was just solid. And we just had no solid sort of players of that ilk. And I still remember, which was quite sad, we recruited a young fella who was fantastic, Jesse Lonergan. In his first year, he's picked 7, I think, from memory, picked 5 or 7. He ended up captaining our reserves team. And I remember looking at the list manager and the recruiter, and our Josh Fraser was the coach, and I said, that's not right. He shouldn't be doing that because, he's the first time up here and it's his 7th game and he's, playing reserve football. He shouldn't be our captain. Like we just had, and I used to always use the cricket analogy. We just needed the senior boys to take the shine off the ball, a bit like the Aussies when they used to play the West Indies. You needed Jeff Marsh and Mark Taylor to take the shine off the ball so these other batsmen could come in and play quite freely. Whereas, we were just too young, because once Gary Ablett and Michael Riscatelli went out of the centre, it was just the kitchen was too hot for David Swallow, Dion Preston and, say, Josh Caddy. I mean, they did as well as they could, but just under, extreme pressure, they were going to come unstuck, as we did in those first few years.
Obviously, a problem that we've seen with drafting in 2024, 2025 is a player will move into state. Look at Harley Reid, for example, and it's pretty much day 2 of him being at the club. There's already talks about at what point is he going to come back to his home state. How difficult was it for you when you're drafting for Gold Coast and there's not exactly a Queensland strong talent at the top of the draft? I think your top 2 boys were from WA, your 3rd pick was from SA, and then a few more in the top 10 were from Victoria. How hard was it for you to not only try and get those guys comfy at home, but then also swat away a lot of what would have been media attention on how soon some of these guys are going to come back home to Victoria or South Australia or Western Australia?
Yeah, well, we just had, we raised the stadium, so we went from Carrara to Metricon Stadium, so the boys could train out the back and see that the old stand coming down, where we did train in, obviously play in the 18s and a bit of the VFL year. And then they could see that the phoenix, if you like, rising from the ashes. So there was, we're selling them a hope, but also obviously with Gary and some of the mature players that were going to come to play, we keep everyone together. This is what the dream's going to be, and it's going to be, it's going to be pretty quick. And I said, obviously the first 2 years when, we still had our L plates on, and the older boys were really just shouldering the load for these young kids, 3 wins, and then that year of these boys turning 21. So they'd been 3 years in the gym. So they'd gone from, squatting 100 kilos to 180 and benching 60 kilos now into 120 kilos and started to throw some weights around. And so we started to get old. But as the attrition of the season kicks in, we start to lose some of those players. So, David Swallow in his first game was clearly playing, or making his debut, was playing his first game. And 3 years in now, he's up to 50 to 60 games. But then he gets injured or gets a soft tissue and we've got to rest him. And now we're replacing him with a younger kid who's only played 20. So, yes, you start sliding back again. And so the critical mass happens. So, but to finish 8 wins and then 10 wins and, Gary gets injured, but also Charlie Dixon went down, Tom Lynch went down, Stephen May went down, Nathan Bock was coming back from a broken leg. So we basically lost our spine. And not a lot of people sort of give us credit for that. And even the night Gary went down, we still hung on. We had no rotations in that last quarter and we beat Collingwood. With no rotations, we had to, the old-fashioned way, we had to rotate our midfielders down into the forward line. Forward line boys would come up and play our midfield. And yeah, it was remarkable that, we won those games that we did. But anyway, that was the end of me. But again, the new coach comes in, strips the list back, and they got young again. And so that was the cycle until, obviously, just as Stewie Jew left and Dimmer has come in.
How did you find, we talked about the personnel, how did you find the facilities in those couple of years before hitting the AFL and even in the early years? We heard on our podcast series, AFL Team Builders, last year from some ex-players and some administrators about some of the facilities you actually had to deal with compared to what, a steadily built club like a Collingwood's doing with their own, back and having the Lexus Centre back then. And how did you find, and what did you find with the facilities and what you had to deal with in your first few years of coaching?
Well, I'd love to hear what the players were saying about it because, that was it. It was just the green shed. We're in these dongers where we worked. But as I used to say to people, it doesn't change my IQ if I'm working. I used to call the Lexus Centre back in the day the Taj Mahal, of course. And we're up in the dongers. But I said my IQ didn't improve or I didn't lose any brain cells when I came and worked in a donger up at the Gold Coast. And I said 5 kilos in a pristine facility like the Lexus Centre is no different to 5 kilos up in the green shed that's not air conditioned, and we had to get towels and fans, palm leaves to get some air conditioning and airflow through the thing. I looked at it to say, well, it's just a bit of grit. We're actually teaching these boys to hang on and a bit of grit. And if we can't, we could only train them for so long because they were kids. And then as the kids were getting rested, we couldn't then put the load onto the old blokes because then they were breaking down as well. We had to make sure that their energy was saved for the weekends when we needed it most. So it was a very, very hard, and, the conditioning fella at the time, Andrew Weller, did a fantastic job managing, 53 players. I think 53 in our first year. I think we played all 52, and then in the next year I think I might have a squad of 49 or 50, and again we played all but one, just managing the players and their loads, and I think that helped us bang into the next year where we won 8 games. But the facilities were fairly rustic, let's put it that way. But as I said, it was teaching them grit, and it was also going to teach them when eventually the good facilities came, they would actually respect them more. And cherish them more and look after them more. And look, I actually haven't been up, so I'm really excited to get up Thursday and see the new facilities after the Commonwealth Games. So, it's going to be an eye-opener for me, but, really excited to see the new facilities.
So we've touched on one of the marquee signings, which was Carmichael Hunt, which was a bit of a shock and an eyebrow raiser at the time, given the fact he was a rugby man. As obviously the coach and, I guess teaching him and teaching him the code of AFL football, what was it like, I guess, trying to translate him from one sport to the other? Because he had so many aspects of, rugby that can be translated to AFL football, but obviously so many that just wouldn't even think of.
Well, look, I had a couple of meetings behind the scenes because I wasn't too keen, nothing against Carmichael, because I thought, and again, the reason I probably softened and said, let's get him in, because he was another senior body. I mean, his thighs were as big as you two blokes sitting together. They were massive, and I just thought he'll be able to take some shine and take some heat off the boys in the midfield, get him in some stoppages, just get him to charge through and bang into blokes and basically take some energy out of him. So he was good. He was fantastic in the gym to show a work ethic and all that sort of stuff. I probably thought it was going to be a little bit of a sideshow as well. So, and again, one of the regrets I had was probably because Kenny was my most experienced assistant coach up there. I sort of cut him sort of 20, 25, 30% slack to go and look after Carmichael. So it was just Kenny. No one else. Everyone stay away. Kenny's his first port of call. Yes, when he comes in and plays, of course, he knows Kenny, knows me, and knows all the other coaches. But any advice, let's get around Carmichael, it was just Kenny. So did it take away from a bit of Kenny's time with the full group and offensive ball movement? Maybe. Would we have won some more games with Kenny spending more time with us? Who knows? Maybe 1 or 2 more. I don't think it would have been a huge amount, but I do look at that and think. But again, the fact Carmichael got to play 44 games, kicked the goal after the siren to beat Richmond, ultimately where Dimmer was coaching at the time, I think, we couldn't have squeezed any more out of him. And I say that, you talk about his cards he could put on the table to play AFL football. Well, one wasn't aerobic. I mean, we at that stage, well, most AFL players were averaging around sort of 12 to 15 Ks. Let's average that between midfielders, backs and forwards. Well, Carmichael's GPS was like 4.6K.
Wow.
Playing a full game of rugby. And here he's going from an anaerobic sport into an aerobic sport. And that, you've either got one or the other. You can't morph the other one into, well, you can, but it's going to take you a long time. So, as I say, I take my hat off to him. His discipline, and he was fantastic. He was hard as a cat's head. He was fantastic in the gym to show the boys the work ethic they needed. And then, some of the slaps of meat he would put on the field, I could hear him up in the coach's box. It was, I'm glad I was sitting up there and not copying any of those. But, he was terrific. And to get 44 games out of him, he should really be really proud of that.
Just one quick one on Carmichael. Obviously, the media attention that he would have attracted during his first year there, do you see it sometimes that can be a positive because it takes that attention away from some of the younger guys who are probably worried a bit about pressure and all the lights that might be on them? Did you see some sort of balance and benefit from his arrival and maybe Gary's as well, and the attention they took away from these first year kids who are just trying to get footy first?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, to be fair, I used to say in the early days when Carmichael and Gary were up there, if there was 100 supporters walking down the street, there'd be 80 people on Carmichael's side and 20 people on Gary's side. Then when Gary won the Brownlow in 2013, and then I said there will be 75 people now walking on Carmichael's side and 25 people working on Gary's team. Look, and I mean, as I said, I was only there for the first 4 years of the AFL. So I reckon, and certainly what I hear now is like, I think our biggest membership numbers were, but again, like 17,000 we had members, of which I think the number was like 60 to 70% were like North Melbourne supporters, or Melbourne supporters or Carlton supporters, but then would support Gold Coast when they weren't playing, obviously, their team. And that was 17,000. I hear it's like 30,000 now.
30,000 this week, yeah.
Yeah, and the population numbers, and again, I often get asked why it's a graveyard and why haven't teams succeeded. Well, again, when we first got up there, it was like 350,000 population. We actually caught up last Wednesday and watched the game against the Bombers with a group of old, Scotty Clayton was there, Travis Old was there, Andrew Travis, Andrew Catchell from the AFL was there, and we sat around and the boys, and Dale Dixon, who lived up there, obviously he was a board member, he said like the population I think is almost close to 750,000 to 1 million or 1 million supporters there. So now there's a lot more people and humans that there can get through the games, and obviously now some of them, for how long the club's been going for, 10 years, 15 years now, they've only grown up knowing that Gold Coast is in the competition. So, that's good for the club going forward.
Can we speak about the acquisition of Gary Ablett Jr.? Biggest name in the comp at that point. Obviously, he'd come off a couple of premierships with Geelong, finished 2010 and had moved to you guys. I think you had obviously joined a couple of years prior, but obviously his manager would have been Liam Pickering at the time, I think. How big of a part did you play in trying to get him there? And at what point did you know that you were a chance or probably actually going to get Gary as a Gold Coast player ahead of your first year?
There's obviously conversations going on, probably more when I say the AFL, but certainly Scotty Clayton was our list manager at that time, so he was sort of cut loose. He was down here in Melbourne and he was obviously speaking to managers, left, right and centre. So, and naturally, because when he asked me, I said, well, mate, we need to get the best. And obviously Gary was the best. So I said, that's going to help everyone. And then I would have thought help you sell that to the next person. So, so to get his signing, but there was a time there once he had committed. Obviously, he couldn't sign anything, but he'd committed. And then all of a sudden he was starting to back out. And, Scotty and the manager, Pickers, spoke and then obviously had to come together and sort of not twist his arm, but sort of talk him back into coming around to it, because obviously it was going to be a huge move for him, which I think the move away to Gold Coast and what we were selling him and the AFL was selling him, I think that resonated. I think when I say a challenge, but because he'd sort of lived in the bosom of Geelong all his life, I think there was a part of him that wanted to get away and be his own Gary Ablett on the Gold Coast as well. I think eventually that tipped him into saying, right, no, I'm definitely coming now. I'm all in on this. And so, he was. And, he's I retired when Chris Judd arrived at West Coast. And so I was fairly fresh out of it, saw Juddy, and he, amazing trainer, amazing player. But Gary, I'd say I'd still take Gary, all due respect to Juddy, as good as he was. But just Gary was just so clean. His touch kicking and kicking for goal. And just, like, I remember this game we beat North Melbourne. Boomer Harvey was playing his 4,000th game. Drew Petrie was, taking marks and bursting bladders, all that sort of stuff. Well, this game, and Daniel Wells was silky smooth and all that sort of. It was like a cake of soap to those three blokes. Gary was picking up one-handed, snapping balls across his body, 45 out, kicking banana goals. And I remember talking to hey Kenny, is it just dry for Gary? I mean, how does he do this? And Kenny would just look at me and go, mate, he's just a freak. But he'd work on his craft. The other super thing he did off field that not a lot of people would give him credit for is his recovery. So I always talk about giving yourself the best chance to be your best. Well, he did, and no one does it as well as he. He used to ring up the Metricon staff to open up at 12:30 or 2:30 in the morning so he could go and do another recovery session. So he was ready to go. And so everyone, as you know, from round 1 down to round 23 or into finals now, they'll drop off. There's a natural attrition because you can only do so much recovery in the week and all that sort of stuff, whereas Gary would do extra. And so his drop-off was a lot slower. And like I'd always say, he may drop down to 98% by come finals. Clearly what I saw when he was playing, obviously at Gold Coast we didn't, but when he was playing for Geelong, whereas most people will be around 80%, but that's most people. So you don't see that the difference between players because they are what they are, because that's the majority of how the people are feeling. But Gary just gave himself the best chance to be 100% each week, and that's why he played the way he played.
You can give a quick answer here if you want. Obviously, you've got a great look at Gary. You would have got a close look at his old man when you were playing for West Coast as well. You've also got Ken Hinkley right next to you, who also would have got a good look at Gary Ablett Jr. Do you have one that you reckon was better? Different roles, but do you have one that you think you would take more?
Junior? Yeah, just again midfield. He got sat on. He'd have 2 blokes. He'd have 3 blokes sometimes against in Gold Coast. I don't know how he went. Well, I know when I was coached against him as a midfield coach at Geelong, we had 1 bloke at the stoppage for him, and then 1 waiting for him, knowing full well he's going to beat the bloke at the stoppage. So we had a backup plan for a backup plan, if you like. And then at Gold Coast, there'd be 3 or 4 blokes just trying to run off him and through him. But Junior was the best I've ever seen. Yeah.
So talk us through that deflating moment when Gaz, dislocated a shot against the Pies. As you said and alluded to, it was a great win for the club. And it was actually quite a successful season given the fact that previous couple of years weren't maybe where you'd want it to be, but you were on the up. But obviously, middle of the year, you guys were pushing for finals for the first time. Gaz goes down. Can you talk us through maybe the deflating part of that injury, and then obviously the lead in to the rest of the remainder of the year where obviously you guys ended up missing out on finals, and then that also being your last year as coach?
Yeah, well, and again, it sets that loading of the players, and I reckon I've seen Gary get tackled like that because obviously he was heavily tagged and things like that and land on the ground, and I'm not certainly pointing the finger at conditioning staff or his recovery. I've just lauded both those areas, but it was just that 1 or 2% where I reckon he was just under fatigue because carrying these kids for so long, and not just that season, not just that game, but for the time up on the Gold Coast. So when he landed and fell, he just couldn't get the arm extended or to brace himself the way he had normally done, and I've seen him do that 1,000 times. Just McCaffer just got him at a right, and again maybe just that extra fatigue in his body. He just couldn't brace himself, and his shoulder went. And then he was early in the game, and then we lost another 2 or 3 others, and so we had no rotations. I remember David Swallow and Dion Prestia and Michael Riscatelli all rotating forward, and we hung on and beat Collingwood, which was fantastic. And then we just lost our way in the last part of the season because obviously the impetus of Gary. And look, I think there was the Brisbane game. We'd come off the bye. We got beaten. I think it was either Footscray or Richmond again up in Canberra. I think it was Footscray. We got beaten by just, again, a couple of goals or something. Went into a bye. We came off and we were horrible against Brisbane. Like literally terrible. We had 120 possessions against like 50 or something in the first quarter. Although, again, after half time we hung on, but the damage was done in that first quarter. I think that was our worst loss. I still remember our second last game when the media fella came up to me, and because I'd talk about games average and how many games you sort of need, and like we were talking 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 at best, whereas the premiers, for example, over the last 5 years play 3,000. I mean, there's enough spoken about Collingwood this year with 3,800 games of experience. Well, we're trying to win a game and we got 1,200. We lose Gary, and he's 200, so we're back down to 1,000 straight away. And on top of that, Nathan Bock goes down. or he's coming back from a broken leg. And like I mentioned before, and Charlie Dixon, our centre half forward or full forward, Tom Lynch, our centre half forward, Gary, our centreman, Nathan Bock, our centre half back, and Stephen May went down in that period. So we actually lost our spine. Now, you take a spine out of any side, let alone a young club trying to find their way in the AFL, and we came a cropper. And so I think we went 1-7. I think we were 7-4. We're playing some of the, some footy that was just, it was just brilliant. Gary, Aaron Hall, Harley Bennell running around. It was just super footy. It was fantastic. And, bubbling along really nicely. And then, as I said, Gary, and I always say Gary, everyone talks to Gary, of course. And, look, he was probably going to win another Brownlow. We weren't setting him up to win one or anything. That just happens. Gary, the first to talk to that. And then, we lost some other critical players that we just, and I said this game, second last game against Essendon, we lost to them. I think we're very close at 3/4 time. But, our two oldest blokes was Jared Harbrow and Michael Riscatelli. The rest was kids. We're running around. They were their only two oldest, the two of our older statesmen. And he came up to me and said, Bluey, you realise that this game is actually your most least experienced team going around. I looked at him and said, well, that can't be right. We're 4 years into the build. I mean, these kids, surely. But in our first year, of course, we had Campbell Brown. We obviously had Gary, Josh Fraser, all these blokes, and 15 debutants. But the good news was, the way I saw it was, well, those 15 debutants had grown up. They actually had 60 and 70 games together, and gone past the old blokes. And so the old blokes had been tipped out. And so, so it was amazing. So it was actually, it was the second last game of our fourth year. We actually got young again, but we were still competitive. That was the exciting thing. These blokes could actually stand their ground. But anyway, the club made their decision, and unfortunately, I couldn't see it through.
Can I just ask you about one player in particular who's could be talked about a fair bit this week, is David Swallow, your inaugural draft selection at Gold Coast, and the only inaugural son still at the club who could play in a final this week. What do you think that would mean to him, just a workhorse player he's been, to try and continuously get his body right over the last 14, 15 years, and the player that you saw from day one to the player you still see in him now?
Making me a little bit watery. Fantastic. And the reason I'm getting a bit emotional, because he'll be the first one to say, don't pick me for emotion's sake. He'll be saying, the jumper, as I used to always say, you blokes get to bring that jumper to life, so be proud of what you do. But he'd be saying, this is a club decision, not an individual decision. I suspect, what I understand of Junior, having worked with him early days and the sort of person he is, if he was selected, the growth or the extra leg, if you like to call it, or the extra yard that the players can run on this final would only be enhanced if he was selected. But I know he, behind the scenes, would be telling Dimmer, don't pick me for any other reason. I have to earn my spot. And if I haven't earned my spot, don't pick me, because the club is before him. But my time at the football club, it was always, that was his mantra. He trained like a man in a boy's body when he first got there. I mean, his body wasn't like a boy. He'd spent some time in a gym, of course, and I think with his older brother Andrew, he'd done a few little sneaky weight sessions as a young fella, which only helped him. And his ability, early days when we couldn't kick a goal, he'd find a way to find a snap out of a forward stoppage and kick a goal. It's just because he talked about scoreboard nourishment a lot, and his ability to impact the scoreboard was phenomenal. A lot of the games we didn't win, of course, but he'd just find a way to just muscle his way through a stoppage and get boot to ball and kick a goal. And the type of fella you see on the field, he reminds me, and he plays in 24, he reminds me a lot of my good mate John Worsfold, who's Clark Kent, Superman on the field, Clark Kent off the field. And Junior was no different, just such a combative person at the contest and a fearsome competitor. Anyone not wearing your colours, look out. And he would equally work just as hard on off the field, in the gym, recovery, do all those sorts of things. But if you met him off field, he's the meekest and mildest and most respectful man you could ever meet.
Now, the current Suns coach, Dimmer, he said about Swallow himself that he would be the first person to get a statue built in his honour if the Suns were to go down that path. Now, obviously, we understand that the gravity in which he holds at the club, being, as we've alluded to, the first pick. When you were coach, and obviously now he's on the brink of, playing that first finals, how much would that mean to see him, I guess, and honoured in that way, potentially? for yourself?
No question. I was going to say, have they got rid of my statue already? Have they taken that down? Jeez. That didn't last long, did it? No. I mean, well, he should be. And look, there's been some players obviously left. I mean, Dion Prestia and Tommy Lynch and all those sorts of things. And look, there were some conversations a couple of those lads had with me. And for 8 years, that 8-year period, I think, or 7 or 8 year period, I mean, I said to him, well, I'm a loyalist. I would stay if I was both of them. But it's your choice. I mean, I don't think the club could ask any more of you fellas, because I remember taking him to Arizona, their second pre-season as, as babies, and living away from home and all the things we had to put up with. 35. We had 35 host families in the first few years. 35. I just left Collingwood and one of the big, and Essendon even, worked for both of those clubs. At best, they had 4 host family and struggled to get 4. We had 35 in the first few years of Gold Coast. It's unheard of, where these blokes used to, sometimes some of them used to sleep in garages because they didn't have their own. We had, that's all we could find for them. So what those boys did in the early years, and then, so I don't I don't blame him from leaving, but for Junior to stay on and go through what he's been through, be club captain and live through the early days and to see where it is now, I dip my lid to him, and I'm so proud and honoured for him to obviously run out potentially in a final series for the Gold Coast.
Obviously, you've spoken a lot about building a list, your role, what you do again, what you try and avoid. When we talk about Tasmania and them coming into the competition just around the corner in the next few years, if they came to you and said, what do you think the Suns did best, and what do you think the Suns would have avoided if they could, what would be your advice to a new AFL team trying to build their list? Yeah,
well, I referenced GWS. I think they did it pretty well as far as you get all these hot young picks, which are great, but you need those experienced fellas around them to take the shine off the ball. So you get into that second and third year because, again, depending on scenarios, and again, not super across the Tasmanian list build, but I dare say there'll be a lot more older talent early days, not as much young talent, which is important. But then in that second and third year, it's then weighing up. You've got to quickly work out because, again, the recruiter's job and the list manager's is so tough to get those picks right with players. I mean, what's a year that we don't redo a draft? And we all do it. But again, it's because that player, as good as he might be, turns up into a list that's either an old list, a young list, or a middle-of-the-road list. So it has an impact on their development. So it's so important that when Tassie pick out the good youth, again, not all are going to be superstars, but then pick out the ones that are going to be, which again is hard after over 12 months or 2 years in the system, mind you, is then when they go back to the draft, instead of having 4, 5 or 6 picks, I'd limit that, bundle them up and get some 23, 24-year-old players that might be playing reserves football. And I always say, look at a midfield that's smashing it right now. So maybe like a Brisbane. Okay, go and find the midfielder that's in their reserves, because you can't get a game in their best 6 midfielders at the moment, but who could? You'd have to be a superstar. Okay, well, let's go and find the 7th and 8th, because at any other club, he'd be playing good football. So let's get him in and get that player where you might be able to get a cheaper deal for him. Obviously, getting someone that's already playing in those positions helps, of course, but that's just going to cost the club and money and draft picks and things like that. So, the sooner they can, I always say, sooner a boy can look like a man and play like a man, the more competitive you're going to be.
Now, there seems like there's a considered effort for Tasmania to start immediately up and running, where there seems to be AFL intervening to try and get them going as soon as they can. And obviously Gold Coast maybe took a little while, maybe so to speak. But do you think the AFL set Gold Coast up to not necessarily fail, but with difficulties, because they've obviously looked back on those maybe concessions that they offered both yourself and the Giants, and I think they might be improving those ideally, so then Tasmania don't have to maybe miss out on finals appearances like the Gold Coast have for 15 years.
Oh yeah, look. I think certainly GWS, on hindsight, when they came in the year after us, was done a lot on the hindsight of obviously Gold Coast, no question. The other thing that we were just talking at we talked about the good and the bad. If you could change something, I said that the soft cap on the footy spend, because when that was discussed in 2006. For us getting ready for 2008 in the 18s year, I thought it was one of my great negotiations because there was going to be 17 clubs that said, we got to be the 18th spin in the footy department. We can't be the 9th, we got to be the 8th. And I think it was Ian Anderson, backwards and forwards. And eventually I had my first win. We got to the 8th spin. Problem being, that was 2006. 2008, when we started in the 18s year, all of a sudden the huge AFL footy spend went nuts in the AFL. So our 8th spend turned up to about the 28th spend. It was that far behind everyone. And that's like I was saying that night, I said, we had one welfare officer. We had one conditioning bloke, but we had the biggest list, 53. When we could have had 58. It was 53. Most lists, I think, were down to 46 or 48. Might even been 42. We had the biggest list, but we had the smallest coaching staff. We had the smallest welfare. I mean, go figure. And so myself, conditioning coach, welfare coach, the other assistant coaches, I always joke and laughed. When I came out of Gold Coast, I spent 1 year in the media, then went and worked as the midfield coach at Essendon. I had more staff at Essendon as a midfield coach than I did have full-time staff at the Gold Coast. But I only had 15 players running around me at Essendon. Up there, I had 53. So, but again, the AFL didn't know that. We didn't know that. It was just all of a sudden the skyrocketing of football spend around recruiting and coaching and all that sort of stuff just went nuts. And the spend was already locked in. And so that was it. So yeah, I think Tasmania from that side of things. And I think that was the bleed on the AFL for many years after that, because they sort of, instead of having the cash, they had to keep giving it up, stumping it up. And that's why Gold Coast, I think, has been a bit of a ball for them. Whereas Tasmania, they're saying, no, if we can get you up and running, we can get crowds through the gate, we can get support through there. That means there's money in the coffers, and so all of a sudden the money churn in a good way happens a lot sooner.
Go back almost 4 decades, late 80s, you joined West Coast, another new project for the AFL. Can you just talk us through, I guess, the differences, what you've seen obviously the last decade in your time with the Suns and now what we're seeing with Tassie, but the West Coast Eagles, another new flight side, interstate side after the VFL, and I guess your early years there and growing it into a premiership list, which you did in the early and mid-90s.
Yeah, well, and again, some of those lessons I took into, which I think helped me actually secure the job, because there was things there in the early days of West Coast where we didn't have a home base. We played at Subi, but we trained all over the place, and I said, no, and we hated it. And even, I think I heard Simon Goodwin talk about where Melbourne train on an off night or two down south rather than up near Melbourne. So that was important. So yeah, a lot of those lessons, and it was so good. Well, so bad, but also so good. So a lot of the bad things around West Coast, like that, having a small list, the travel, all those type of things, how hard and how much you had to sort of back off training some weeks because of the travel and all those sorts of things. Getting used to that, that certainly helped me when I came to Gold Coast around all that sort of stuff. And that's why even the Brisbane players, we couldn't let them travel an hour from Brisbane down to Gold Coast, train and then travel back. Well, that's why we had 35 host families and things like that. So a lot of lessons. But again, that was part of my sell to the Gold Coast kids. You're going to be part of something special here. And like I was fortunate enough to be part of something at West Coast. I didn't start the first year. I joined them the second year. But to be part of that first premiership in 92, we played 91, got beaten badly by Hawthorn, and then butted up in 92, and to beat Geelong in 92, no one can ever take that away from you, and that was always my sell to the Gold Coast kids. You're the pioneer here in Gold Coast, the state of Brisbane. Yes, the Lions have come up here, they're up the road, fresh off 3 flags, all that sort of stuff, but we're now here competing against them, but then competing the rest of the other teams who are in the competition. I said, who would love to have their name on an honour board to say you're the first Gold Coast premiership player? And all the young fellas put up their hands. I said, well, this is where it starts. Let's roll up our sleeves and let's get into it. So, yeah, it was. I was very fortunate at West Coast and to live and then play in an era where 10 years. Mick Malthouse came. We'd played in a series with John Todd in '88. Collapsed badly in '89, and then Mick Malthouse came over with all that East Coast wisdom. And then, spent 1990 to 2000 playing in finals, which was quite special.
I guess on the flip side, the modern day Eagles are probably struggling, or they are struggling under Andrew McCall and even Adam Simpson there for a few years.
Yeah.
What would your, I guess, recommendations be, I guess, in terms of the rebuild? So they've gone pretty heavy on the draft. They're looking at bringing in local talent. They've re-signed Harley Reid, which is a huge deal, especially for them. And obviously you've been part of a list build and been at successful clubs as well, both a player and assistant coach. But what would you give recommendations to Andrew McCall for?
Yeah, well, and again, well, not so much for him. Clearly he can coach. He's been elected by the board and chosen as coach. But again, I mean, I go through the games average, and I get onto the AFL tables, and they're rolling out sides of 1,600 games of experience. 1,600. Again, sides are around 20. I think Adelaide finished on top. They were 2,400 games of experience. So you can compete to a certain time, and then all of a sudden, as I said, the whoopee cushion effect happens, and the kids just run out of gas. They just can't run as far. They can't hit as hard. They can't kick as far. They can't run for 120 minutes like a mature side. I mean, again, Geelong are over 3,000. Brisbane's over 3,000. Collingwood's over 3,000. You look at the top 8, and each year I look at the top 4 and then the bottom 4, and there's always consistency. They're always 3,000. The ones down the bottom are between 1,000 and 1,500 games of experience. So they're just young. So I know they've been to the draft a bit. They just have to now sit pretty. They have to go through those draft picks and the kids they've played for 1 or 2 years and go, right, he can play. I'm not sure about him. And then if you're going to get some kids, but if you're going to go to the draft, and as I said, it comes a tipping point when you go, we've got enough kids now. Let's bundle up a couple of draft picks and let's go and get a mature player. And again, look, Harley's been fantastic because he's a generational player. And again, I know we've spoken about, I don't want to pick on Chris Judd here all the time, but about Gary Ablett versus Chris Judd. But I saw Harley Reid, I saw Chris Judd in his first year and he was fantastic. But I've seen Harley Reid do, and I think to judge Harley fairly, look at him last year, don't look at him this year, and all due respect to Mark Graham, because last year when he had Elliot Yeo, Tim Kelly, a couple of other senior boys running around him, all of a sudden he was coming in first, second and third drop, and they were tagging these other blokes. This year, again, all due respect to Mark Graham, if I'm an opposition coach and I'm looking at Harley Reid or Mark Graham, I know who I'm sitting on. So all of a sudden he's had to deal with this year around. But I look at him last year and the things he was doing as a first-year player, I saw him more ballistic and probably just slightly a bit cleaner than Chris Judd. And I thought, wow, and look how Chris Judd turned out. So if he's still got, he has to prove over the journey, of course, because Juddy with his discipline and his hard training and his work ethic and his due diligence and all that sort of stuff, that's what Harley needs to learn that. I'm sure he's learning that under Minnie and the other coaches and the other senior players. But again, I ask you fellas, who are the other senior players? They got 3. So what? Who's teaching him, if you know what I mean? So that's what hold him back a little bit. But again, hopefully the coaches and the senior players that are there are helping him. Shannon Hearn's an ex-captain and he's on the coaching staff, so I'm sure he's into his ear. But he wasn't a midfielder, but, I'm sure he's helping him with all those type of things. So again, West Coast people, and again, as foreign, I reckon the club's struggling with it, and so are the fans over there because they've never experienced a drought like this for West Coast, so it's okay. It's all right. Just imagine being a St Kilda supporter. Like, seriously, they've been one since inception of them as a club, So anyway, I said they just need to get older. As I said, the same about Gold Coast and all the clubs down there. And again, I reference this, and I say this respectfully, because he's arguably the greatest modern-day coach going around, Alistair Clarkson. How's he gone with a young list at North and an injured list? How's he gone? What, they won 5 games? It's not like he's won 8 or 10 or 12 and he's playing finals. It's hard. And I know Mick Malthouse said it when I started my coaching journey with him. He said, mate, you've never coached a side until you've coached a bottom 4 team. Because you go into a coaching game with one arm tied behind your back. That coach over there's got 3,000 games of experience plus. He's got 5 or 6 good players. He got levers to pull. Minnie's going in there with maybe one lever to pull. And if that doesn't come off, well, what hope have you got? So, and that's what happens when because when you're down in the bottom 4, it's generally because you're young. You're one of the youngest teams going around because you'll compete to half time. You'll stay in a game or you'll stay in a season, but eventually the workload becomes too much for too few, and they collapse.
All right, Guy, right before we wrap things up, quick, what is your premiership prediction for ahead of the finals?
Well, before the season started, I always said Brisbane. I picked Brisbane last year, which was great, and I thought with some of their injuries and some of those players coming back, and we always talk about in the AFL world and finals and back-to-back premierships. Premierships are hard, but back-to-back's unheard of. Is the hunger factor, and I just thought they're going to have a turnover of about 10 or 15% of the players that missed out last year that want a flag and know how good these other blokes, so they've won one, so they're going to drive them. So I'm still bullish on them. Adelaide have been fantastic. So I'm hoping it's an Adelaide-Brisbane. I don't know how finals work and all that sort of stuff, but if that's the grand final, I'm probably picking those two, but hopefully Brisbane kick it after the siren and go back-to-back.
Well, Bluey, thanks again for hanging out with Zero Hanger. We had a pleasure having you on.
Much appreciated, boys.
Thanks, Bluey.
See ya.